put it in the chat. Who comes to mind immediately when you think of the tech industry? Who are some like tech titans names that you can think of?
Bill Gates.
Steve Jobs.
Whoa.
Let's forget Steve Jobs.
So we heard Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, beautiful. We love class participation. Thank you for indulging me. So yeah, so you can think of Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, perfect. I don't have Bill Gates on the slide. I do have Jeff Bezos. But what they all have in common is that they're all men. The majority of large tech CEOs, tech executives, people who have innovated within the realm of technology have been men, and also predominantly white men. And this is something that I and many other people in the tech industry are recognizing to be a very critical issue when it comes to not only just diversity and equity, but also the innovation allowed in the tech industry itself. So just a little background on the history of technology is needed, just because we haven't always been as starkly divided in terms of gender diversity when it comes to the tech industry. So in 1843, the first computer programmer was Ada Lovelace. She didn't have a computer per se, but she wrote what is considered to be the first algorithm, the first mathematical proof. In 1942, Hedy Lamarr, who was also a very, very well-known actress, most commonly referred to as the most beautiful woman in the world, she invented technology that was later used for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth that involved like radio frequency hopping. And then in 1952, Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, she made one of the first compilers and actually coined the term bug because she found a physical moth in a server room. And so all of these large moments in history were done by women in tech. Actually, some of the first programmers were women just because it tended to be a job that was stereotypically more feminine. It was detail oriented, involved like plugs and switchboards. And so the majority of original programmers were women. Yet over time, that has become less of the case. And we've seen more men becoming more prevalently involved in the tech industry. So some statistics that show this are the amount of, the percentage of women earning undergraduate computer science degrees. So back in the 1960s, it was around 50-50 gender split, which is wonderful, right? That's all we want, is a little bit of equity. But you start to see in the 1980s with the rise of video games being targeted more towards young boys, and a lot of people cite video games as their incentive to get into technology, the number starts to drop to 37%. And then more recently in 2011, the number of, the percentage of women earning tech degrees was 18%, which is overall just a very disheartening statistic to see. In fact, even when you get to higher level degrees like master's and PhD, women earn even fewer. Like I know I specifically go to Cornell, and the first Black woman to earn a PhD in CS at Cornell graduated like last year. And it's great to have those moments where you're breaking boundaries, but I don't necessarily think that those boundaries should have waited to have been broken until like 2019 and 2020. It seems a little bit too late in my opinion. And then some just general statistics are about the tech industry are that like 25% of tech employees are female. The majority of these are entry-level positions or like junior engineers, but the majority, or almost the majority of the American workforce is female, around 45%. And also these statistics for context are based in America. So I didn't really do any research into the global diversity in tech issue, but was more focused in the Americas. In tech, an average salary for a woman is around $75,000. Obviously, this doesn't take into account intersectional identities. So in 2013, the National Committee on Pay Equity actually did an analysis of the gender gap, or the wage gap across gender and race, and showed that white women earn 75 cents to every dollar that a white man earns. Black women, it's 64%, and Hispanic women is 54%. So being a woman alone means that you're going to earn less than a man, which is around $91,000 on average, but then having an intersectional identity of perhaps being a person of color or a part of the LGBTQIA community will bump that down even more. And then a shocking 11% of Fortune 500 executives are women. I believe only 4 Fortune 500 CEOs are actually people of color in general. So again, that intersectionality plays into it. Whereas 83% of consumer spending is influenced by women. So what you can kind of take from these really sad statistics is that even though women do play a large role in consuming technology, working in the workforce, we don't get the representation and compensation that we're duly earned by us. And so this is kind of ties me into who I am. So I'm Caitlin Stanton, as Katie introduced me. I've been doing technology since high school, and I also speak from the perspective of being a white cis woman in tech. So I have a relative amount of privilege when it comes to the educational and internship opportunities I've been able to have in order to give me this power and platform to be very involved in tech. And because of that, I spend a lot of my free time, if you can call it free time, speaking about diversity in tech and trying to be an advocate for people who identify as part of underrepresented communities. So I do this through public speaking, I do this through social media, through workshops, particularly targeted towards young girls, just because for me, I found it very hard to get into the tech field, even with all of the level ups I was given by being from a family who was focused on education, by having certain opportunities to go to college. Even I found it very difficult. And so what I try to do in my everyday life is make sure that other people feel empowered and feel like they can have access to equitable resources in order to gain those tech skills, since that's something that's becoming way more ubiquitous in the world as tech surrounds us more and more every day. My background is I earned my Bachelor's of Science from Cornell University last spring, and I'm currently earning my Master's of Engineering at Cornell in electrical and computer engineering. I've interned at Qualcomm, which is a chip manufacturer, Microsoft, and Lyft, who I specifically was working on their self-driving car division. And additionally, I am involved in a lot of diversity and tech initiatives on campus, including the engineering sorority Alpha Mega Epsilon, and women in computing at Cornell. So I try to make sure that I'm not only representing my true self in the workforce and in academic spaces, but also, again, doing my part to work with communities to help fellow underrepresented minorities in technology. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my transition or my journey through high school and through college into who I am today as a technologist. So these are also very embarrassing photos, which is very fun to look into. But essentially in high school, I was very lost. I had gone to what are called gifted and talented schools. I'm from New York City, so there are certain programs for people who are to test better. And so I had gone through all these educational programs. I had gotten very good schooling up until this point, but I didn't really know what path I wanted to travel down. Sorry, there's a fire truck. I didn't really know what path I wanted to travel down. For the longest time, I thought I was going to be an architect. And then after being involved in an architecture mentorship program, I quickly realized that was not the path for me. But I had spent literally all of my life since age 8 thinking that I was going to go down this career path. So I was lost. I was also a very quiet student. I excelled academically, but I never really felt like I had the confidence to speak up in class. I did the thing where I kind of waited until the very last second until I was 200% sure of my answer before raising my hand. And by that time, it was always too late. So almost all of my high school teachers were like, Caitlin's smart, but she doesn't raise her hand. She doesn't talk at all. And it had gotten to a point where my parents kind of accepted that that was who I was. And that's how I was going to act in the classroom. But there was always something in the back of my head that was telling me I need to find my focus, find my passion, but then also find my confidence and be able to put myself forward in those kinds of uncomfortable public situations, whether it's raising your hand in a classroom or in the case of public speaking, which is something that I find very valuable, getting up on that stage and speaking to other people. So my life kind of pivoted in the summer before my junior year of high school when I became involved in Girls Who Code, which is, I was specifically involved in the summer immersion program, which was a foundational computer science boot camp for young girls. I was in a classroom of 20 other women who had varying levels of computer science knowledge. I myself had taken a single class but had hated it. So it was very ironic that I was in the boot camp in the first place. I really did not want to be a part of the program just because at that moment, I really didn't know what computer science meant. I had taken a single class and we had done some like mathematical modeling, and I immediately knew that was not for me. I am not that much of a math nerd, so I kind of chalked CS up to being very boring, but it was one of those skills that my parents knew was relevant. And so they forced me to sign up for Girls Who Code. And I showed up for the first day thinking that it was just going to be a boring lecture where I would learn about like for loops and variables and all that jazz, and go home, maybe do homework for it, and then come back the next day and have this repetitive cycle of just learning theory. I was completely wrong. And I think honestly, that's one of the main reasons that I decided to go into tech, where all of the time spent in the classroom was not only spent learning, obviously, the fundamentals of coding, but then also putting those skills to good use. So whether it was programming a robot to draw a certain shape, or it was making the scrolling background for a video game, we were actually taking the concepts that we used or that we were learning and applying them. And that really told me how wide of the range of possibilities technology can actually bring. And once I saw that, once I started to gain confidence in my skills as a programmer, and then could actually see where I could, where the skill set could lead me both through college and then as a career path, I immediately decided, okay, I really enjoy programming. I enjoy the thrill of writing a single line of code and seeing it change something on my website or my app or on my robot. Let's continue with this, you know? And I think especially because I was in a room full of women, my teachers were women, my TAs were women, my classmates were women, it really created a supportive environment where even though I originally did not know anything about what I was doing, I felt like I could make mistakes, that I could ask questions. I felt very comfortable. So I had come from a place where in high school, I wasn't really comfortable speaking up in class, wasn't very comfortable asking for help, to a new environment where I spoke freely. I would say something, it was wrong, and I learned from it, and I didn't feel embarrassed. And that was not only a turning point for me in terms of my technical skills and my technical interests, but then also just for me in my feeling of self-worth, and how confident I felt in social situations. And so then afterwards, the second half of my high school career, I became essentially Coder Caitlin. I went to a ton of hackathons. Fun fact, this is my first hackathon since college started, so I'm very excited to be back in the saddle. But I started going to hackathons more and more with my friends. I really enjoyed the rapid prototyping cycle, the fact that I was learning new tech skills, but then also working on my non-technical skills for presenting and for teamwork and like meeting new people. And I thought it was a really great experience. I started taking more computer science classes. I was also lucky enough to get a couple internships through Girls Who Code. So I was basically spending all of my free time coding at coding events, doing coding assignments, or working and writing code. And this just was very thrilling for me. And I also noticed that in my junior and senior years, I felt more inclined to put myself out there, whether it was to found a hackathon organization and like contact sponsors for like thousands of dollars of money as a 17-year-old, which is something that not a lot of people would do, or just the typical answering questions in class. And so again, like Girls Who Code was really that empowering moment for me to kind of feel centered, where I found my niche, I found what I was interested in, and I had found the confidence to move forward with that. And so then college. As I said before, I currently go to Cornell University. That's me throwing my graduation cap last semester and on an empty campus. And for me, I really wanted to utilize college as a place to not only like earn a degree, but also round out what I know, right? So I very much enjoy being an engineer, but I also want to make sure that I'm leaving with a well-rounded set of skills, whether it's non-technical, social, academic, professional, because I'm a big believer that tech is interdisciplinary, and by exposing myself to various different fields, I will end up being a better engineer. And so I've done this through, again, the various diversity and tech initiatives that I'm involved in. So Alpha Mega Epsilon, Women Computing at Cornell. I've done this through being a teaching assistant, so being able to explain concepts to people who are not as well versed in circuitry or in digital logic or in signals as I am. I've done research, so being able to take initiative and work on a project autonomously, so making my own decisions about how that research should go, and then being able to summarize my findings to my professor. My coursework, so I'm electrical and computer engineering, so being able to go throughout the entire tech stack, learning both from lower level machine code and hardware to higher level programming has been amazing, because not only do I get to actually learn these new concepts, I also get to understand how each level of the tech stack operates, like how a circuit can control Boolean algebra, which then controls machine code, which then controls how you can run a program on a computer. And then overall friends. I think that's something that I found to be a common thread throughout all of my technology experiences, is the supportive network of friends that I've had along the way. Back in Girls Who Code, I had 20 other girls to rely on, to message randomly if I had a problem, to take along with me to hackathons. And I found that same community at Cornell, where I had friends who would stay up and answer my questions on problem sets, and who would go to on-campus events with me. And so by having that network of people that I could turn to, both for academic purposes, but then also more importantly for social purposes, ended up being a very, very valuable resource for me in my academic career, and still ends up being a very valuable resource for me today as I'm earning my master's degree and as I continue to forge ahead on my career path. So I mentioned this before, I am a woman in STEM. I'm a white cis woman in STEM. And so it hasn't been a very linear journey. I didn't wake up one day, my parents gifted me an Arduino, and then I just started coding, and that was it. And then I just became a hacker. It was a slow process where I kind of had to be nudged along the way to take these opportunities in hand and move forward with them, and feel confident in myself and my coding abilities, and like take initiative to go to these events and take these courses and apply for this major. And I think that's a unique experience with being a woman in STEM, because you don't necessarily have those doors opened for you. You have to open them yourself. And that's very difficult, especially when you consider the intersectional identities of people and how certain people don't have access to educational opportunities, or to technical resources. And so it just becomes very, very, very hard to push your way into a field that is truly going to be the forefront of how we shape our society. So some things I've experienced as a woman in STEM are imposter syndrome is one of them. So imposter syndrome is defined as feeling as if you are an imposter. So whether you walk into a classroom and you think to yourself, like, why am I even here? Or you go to your job one day and you're like, how did I even get this job? I don't belong here. I'm not qualified. It's moments like that where you experience huge amounts of self-doubt, like overwhelming amounts of self-doubt. And in some cases can cripple your productivity, cripple your ability to be passionate about a certain field. And I like to say that even though I might seem successful on paper, successful on my LinkedIn, I experience imposter syndrome like legitimately every day. I think everybody does too, but especially coming from a background of being an underrepresented minority, having imposter syndrome becomes even more exacerbated as a problem, because not only do I walk into classrooms, or I guess like log into Zoom classrooms and feel like I don't belong there, but then I also don't see people who I identify with in those spaces. So I can't necessarily connect with them on that level of identity to be able to form more of a rock solid foundation in terms of believing in myself and believing I belong in those spaces. Something I've tried to do with imposter syndrome, and I think this is just like a work in progress. I'm never going to have a moment where I feel 100% confident 100% of the time. And I don't think anybody feels like that either. Some people are just better at hiding it. But something I've been trying to do with imposter syndrome is, if I feel a certain weakness when I walk into a classroom or walk into an internship, I recognize that. It's important to recognize your weaknesses, right? You're not 100% perfect. You're not going to know everything at an expert level. That's just unheard of. But by acknowledging those weaknesses and realizing that, okay, I can learn from the people around me, I can learn from the resources around me, but then also on the other side of the coin, taking the moment to acknowledge your strengths, right? No matter what, there always will be something that you're strong at, more in comparison to the people in the room with you. So for example, if I walk into a room of a bunch of technologists who are very well versed in like autonomous vehicles, right? Like this is a new space for me. I don't necessarily know everything there is to know about autonomous vehicles. I am still probably stronger than them at being able to I don't know, get on calls with company sponsors, for example, or make a nice PowerPoint, right? You know, like there are certain skills that like, even though they seem minuscule, like those are your strengths and those are ones that you should focus your confidence on and realize that, look, you're really good at this thing, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn other parts, like other fields, other skills, or grow in other ways. And again, this is a work in progress. It takes time. It takes time to process emotions of feeling like an imposter. It takes time to recognize your strengths and weaknesses. And it takes time and it takes effort to reach out to people to build on those weaknesses. But it is something that I consider to be a very important mindset in order to make sure that you're able to push forward. Because as one of my CS professors said back when I was an undergrad, no matter who you are, you belong here. You belong in that classroom, you belong in that job. And it's just convincing yourself that you do belong there is the biggest hurdle that you can face, especially as an underrepresented minority. Next is loneliness. So in my major, around 1/3 of the students are women. And that's definitely exhibited in my friend group. Almost all of my friends in electrical and computer engineering are men. I remember I had a study group that was 5 other women sophomore year, and it was the most exciting thing I had ever experienced, because I was like, wow, I have never worked with this many women at once. And again, it's one of those moments where you look around in the classroom or you look around at your work environment and you notice, okay, there's no one who looks like me, or there's very few people who look like me. And especially now that we're in a virtual environment, it's very hard to kind of form those connections, right? Because you want to make sure that you not only can connect on an interest level, right, in terms of passions or majors or whatever, but you also want to make sure that you can connect on like a cultural level or an identity level. So then you really feel like you have someone who understands where you're coming from, who understands your background, your experiences. Something that I've tried to do to combat loneliness is create spaces for myself on campus or in my jobs. So whether that's by being involved in my engineering sorority, or when I'm at work, being involved in like the Women in Tech employee resource group, or even virtually, I'm involved in a lot of like Slack spaces that are dedicated to women in tech. By finding those connections, whether in person or virtual, it creates a network for you to rely on, both again for academic help or like professional help, but then also for those moments where you really need to rant to someone or you really need someone else's opinion. And again, this is also one of those things that's a work in progress. That's a natural hurdle, right? Because there are going to be spaces where there aren't women in tech, right? And there are going to be times where you're not going to be able to feel as connected to a virtual community as if you had other women in your classes or in your work environments. And that's one of those things where creating those spaces can be very difficult, but that's why it's very important to make sure that you advocate to younger women, to younger underrepresented minorities to go into those spaces so that you can eventually have them create those communities for themselves, so then they don't feel as lonely as you did. Again, very difficult, easier said than done. Like I feel lonely constantly in certain situations, even though I do have like a large network of women in STEM who are my friends and who are my colleagues. And that's why it's important to recognize that equity and diversity in tech is something that's a deeply rooted problem. And it can't just be solved by like starting a club on campus. You need to make sure that not only you start a club on campus to form that community, but then you also reach out to younger people who will be more able to diversify their grade or diversify their community. So then when they do rise up to the same level that you are in terms of like age, in terms of grade, in terms of like work experience, they themselves can build off of that foundation that you created. And then another thing is unconscious and conscious bias. So especially I think now with Black Lives Matter, a lot of people have been speaking out about the devastating effects of bias. And so conscious bias is when you consciously make an effort to say something insensitive, or if you consciously have an effort to say something from a biased point of view. So typically this is taken from the perspective of it being insensitive or bigoted. But in the case of unconscious bias, this becomes more of a gray line because there are a lot of societal norms that people conform to. For example, there's like traditional gender roles where like the woman is meant to stay at home with the family and like the man is supposed to go to work. There are traditional norms regarding sexuality, regarding like racial stereotypes. And these are not necessarily things that most people go out of their way to think, but they've been raised in an environment where those biases are present. And so especially when it comes to interactions with like my male friends, for example, they have that unconscious bias that, like, for example, I'm not as well versed in a concept as they are, so why would they listen to my help on the homework? Or when it comes to working on final projects, maybe they'll be more likely to interrupt me than if I were a male colleague. And so for me, it's very important to take heed of those moments of unconscious bias, whether it's of others or even more importantly myself, and acknowledge them. Because the whole problem with unconscious bias is that you don't understand that it's happening. You don't realize when it's happening. And so by taking a moment to understand, like, okay, why did I say that? Why did I do that? Why did that person say that? Why did that person do that? And kind of talk through them. So then you can then later on, when you feel the need to act on that unconscious bias, you've unlearned that behavior. And you can then teach yourself to not jump to that conclusion, to not lean on that stereotype. And it's one of those moments where, again, this is something I'm going to say a lot. It's very difficult. It requires a lot of unlearning. It's something that I consider myself to be constantly learning every day, because it's very hard to unlearn biases that I've been raised to have since birth. But it's something that we each need to do, not only to make sure that we empower ourselves and don't have like self-inflicted biases, but then also when we're dealing with other underrepresented minorities, when we're interacting with other people who identify differently, we don't hold them in a different light, that we all treat each other in an equitable manner, and that eventually as a society we can all treat each other in an equitable manner despite whatever differences in identity we might have. Then we have the double bind. So this kind of ties into the unconscious bias and how I mentioned those like traditional gender roles. So the double bind, specifically when speaking about women, is stereotypically women are seen in more feminine lights. So they're interpreted to be more nurturing, to be more warm and caring, right? Like a mother duck kind of figure. But when it comes to being in the workplace, being in the workforce, especially if you want to be an executive or a manager, you need to be a little bit more dominant. You need to be more aggressive in your asks. You need to be willing to assign tasks to people in your team, to check in on deadlines, and be really assertive. And that's something that people can't necessarily comprehend, right? Like if a woman is in an executive position, she will be seen as bossy. She'll be seen as bitchy, right? Even though she is doing the same kind of tasks and enacting the same kind of behavior as a man in a similar position. And it's all because there's this traditional stereotype of women being more nurturing, being more caring, being the people to write the birthday card to send around the office, right? So it's similar to unconscious bias. It's one of those things where you have to acknowledge it and call it out. Like understanding, okay, like, would you have spoken over me if I were a man in this meeting? Or if I were a man, would you be more inclined to like listen to my advice and actually follow through on the tasks that I assigned to you? And again, similar to unconscious bias, as you call these things out, people become more aware of the fact that they're leaning on stereotypes, that they're jumping to conclusions. And hopefully, if people unlearn properly, they'll then be able to see that women or other underrepresented minorities who have their own stereotypes can be in these more white male dominated spaces without the weight of stereotypes and like traditional gender roles or traditional racial stereotypes or anything like that weighing down on them. So that was a lot. I'm just going to go through a couple of lessons that I've learned along the way. I've kind of touched on them a little bit before, but I'm just going to like hit them in like brief points, and then I'll open up to questions afterwards. So what I've learned, I've said the word confidence a lot during this presentation. I think it's very, very important to be confident. Again, it's work in progress. I think there are moments where I feel super confident about myself, and then there are moments where I'm like, wow, I really don't, I really don't know what I'm doing. But I think for me, what's most important is to focus on inner confidence. So being able to say at the end of the day that you're satisfied with what you did, that you are a big believer in the decisions you made that day in order to achieve your personal goals, your professional goals, your academic goals. Because you are the last person who has to deal with yourself at the end of the day, right? Like, it's important to keep up with expectations of your friends and family, right? And you want to constantly be pushing yourself. But it's important to also keep yourself in the center of your mind, right? And make sure that whatever decision you're making, whatever behavior you're going through, it's something that you feel confident in and you feel satisfied with. Because otherwise you're going to find yourself in a place further down the line where you look around, you're like, how did I even get here? How did I even make these decisions? Who let me do this? Like, I've lost my place. And by focusing on your inner confidence, hopefully you'll ground yourself so that you make sure that everything you do is intentional towards pursuing your goals, even as they change along in life, because they definitely will. But at least you feel safe and secure in the fact that you've made these decisions on your own behalf. Embracing failure. This is a huge one, especially in the tech community. I feel like people are very, very, they're not quick to acknowledge mistakes or missteps or failures. You'll see a lot of people on LinkedIn, for example, posting about their internships or their research positions, and that's great, right? It's always great to succeed and have those defining moments, but not enough people, in my opinion, talk about the hundreds of job applications they had to send in, or the hundreds of hours they had to spend writing that research paper in order for it to be published. It's very hard for people to acknowledge the amount of work that goes into a success, and the fact that that work is not necessarily a linear line, right? Like, you're not necessarily going to go from point A to point B perfectly. No plan actually goes out to plan. So, for example, like a failure that I experienced recently, recently, was I worked at Microsoft. I was going for a return offer as an intern, and I didn't get that return offer, right? And especially in the tech world, not getting a return offer kind of feels like the end of the world. And it did for a little bit. I definitely did admittedly wallow in my pain, but that's something that I earned. But by having conversations with my manager about it, learning and incorporating feedback from them about how to improve myself as an engineer, how to improve myself as a professional, I was able to understand, like, look, that didn't happen for me. That wasn't it. I didn't get that return offer, but it's not the end of the world. And I can take this as a learning opportunity, a growth opportunity, and better myself, both as a person and a professional. In that specific instance, it was an issue of communication. My manager and I were not on the same page in terms of what I felt like I could get done during the internship. And so then that was something that I made sure to incorporate later on. So, like, during class projects or during my internship at Lyft, I made sure to put a big focus on communication. And that was, again, a lesson that I learned as part of this failure, this huge crushing failure, or it seemed crushing at the time. So, and I think it's very important, especially in tech, for that failure to be normalized, right? I think everybody focuses on the highs and not on the lows. And even though it's good to make sure that you don't necessarily wallow in that negative feeling, that you don't get yourself down in the dumps, to, I guess, put it in a broad term, you're at least normalizing the fact that you do have those mistakes, that you aren't going to make everything and do everything perfectly, because that's just what it means to be human. And more people need to have those kinds of conversations about the amount of work it took to get that success, or about the number of mistakes they've made along the way. Because then otherwise you're just going to see all of these shining stars in technology or shining innovators and just think that they woke up a genius, or they woke up with this beautiful idea and they implemented it and everything worked out well and it was all great and dandy and now they're like a billionaire. That's not how it works, and that's never how it works. And so that's why I think it's important for people to acknowledge and embrace and learn from failures in their everyday lives. So then next is seek mentorship and sponsorship. So mentors and sponsors are actually a little bit different, and not a lot of people know the difference in definition. Mentors are people that you turn to for advice. So maybe it's a professor who you're really close with. Maybe it's your manager at work. Maybe it's a family friend. These are people that you go to for help with a problem, or you want to talk through a solution or something. Sponsors are people who are more action oriented on your behalf. They're willing to advocate for you and for your work. They will, maybe if you're up for a promotion, they'll like talk to the manager who's making that decision and will say like, oh, I think you should consider Caitlin. Like, she's been really steady in her work. She's met all of her deadlines. Her code is immaculate. Like, I think she would be really fit for this position. they're willing to put themselves on the line to uplift you, give you access to opportunities that you might not have had access before. And so it's important to have both mentors and sponsors in your life, because you want to have people that you can turn to for advice, that you can kind of talk things out with. But then you also want to have people who are in relative positions of power and privilege to be able to put your name in arenas where it previously wasn't. This can apply both in academic and professional settings, and sometimes it is harder to find a sponsor than a mentor, but making sure to have that balance between mentorship and sponsorship in your life and the networks that you can turn to is critical, especially if you find yourself, if you are an underrepresented minority and you need that little extra boost to be able to be considered for those like positions, for those promotions, for those opportunities that you otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to. So I mentioned this before, finding your support system. So for me, this is my network of women in tech. So my engineering sorority sisters, my fellow board members in women in computing at Cornell, my friends and family along the way. I've been incredibly privileged to have a group of people constantly supporting me and supporting my educational endeavors. They've never said, oh no, you can't do this. They've always just been like, okay, just go do it. I don't know why you're asking permission for it. And finding those people who will unequivocally support you, but then also give you constructive criticism for you to be a better person, to be a better professional, to be a better student is honestly quite paramount, at least in my opinion, because not only does that give you familiar faces to identify with in classes or at your job or in your community, but then also make sure that you have people who are willing to be honest with you, who are willing to call you out on your BS, on your unconscious bias, on on your mistakes, and are also there to just support you in all of your endeavors. And so again, those are sometimes very hard to come across, especially if you find yourself being the only woman in a tech room or being in a place where it's very hard to connect with people who look like you. And so that's why I always recommend trying to turn to virtual communities as well, because even though they don't necessarily have the same face-to-face interactions, you still at least get to connect with people who you might not have otherwise crossed paths with, and then you can lean on them for support in the future. And especially now that everything's virtual, it's really cool to be able to have that opportunity to reach out to people who you maybe don't live in the same country as, or you don't go to the same school as, and have them incorporate into your support system, but then also learn from their backgrounds, learn from their experiences, and kind of open your eyes up to different parts of the world and different parts of identity that you otherwise would have no idea of because you hadn't interacted with that kind of person before. Take care of yourself. Oh my gosh, especially now that you're spending like 16 hours a day, probably staring at your laptop at least. I'll say a little anecdote about this. Back in sophomore year is traditionally like one of the harder years of your engineering career here at Cornell, because you're taking fundamental classes. You're learning like the first basic skill sets of your major. I had the bright idea of taking 5 technical classes while also running my engineering sorority, being a board member for WIC, being a teaching assistant, like running a career fair, writing for a newspaper. I was just like doing way too much. And there came a point during the year where I didn't see any of my friends except for the people who I knew in my major. I was constantly going to bed at 3 a.m. and waking up at 7:30 for my 9 a.m. lecture. And I was like nodding off in class. I fell asleep during exams. Like I just wasn't paying attention. I could not function as a person. And it all culminated to this one moment in office hours where I was talking to a TA and I literally could not understand a word he was saying. I only understand English. I only speak English. There wasn't any like wiring in terms of like translating into another language. Like that wasn't what was happening. And he was also only speaking English. Like my partner understood what he was saying. I just literally could not. My brain was not functioning at all. And it scared me so badly. I like took a nap immediately and I woke up and I felt a lot better. But that was kind of the wake up call I needed to tell me like, hey, like your parents were right when they said to sleep at a reasonable time, and making sure to take time to eat as healthily as you can and exercise, or at least get outside, and make sure you take time for breaks for you to kind of like veg out if that's something that you need to do, or to pursue your hobbies, or to hang out with your friends. And also just making sure that you don't overextend yourself. Like I along with probably a ton of people, feel the need to say yes to every single opportunity, which is not healthy at all. So making sure that you prioritize your time. So not only are you fulfilling your obligations, but you're also doing what you love, and you're taking care of yourself physically, mentally, and emotionally. Because at the end of the day, if you're burning yourself out, that's not going to help you. That's not going to help the research lab you're a part of. It's not going to help your classes. It's not going to help your job, because you're not going to be able to do anything. And you're also not going to feel like you're putting 100% of yourself into the things that you care about. And for me, I never wanted to have that feeling again, where I felt like I wasn't really focusing on the causes that I was passionate about, or taking time to understand material in classes that I really enjoyed. So it was one of those moments where, again, it was a huge wake up call. I restructured my entire life. I cut down on the number of activities I was involved in. And now as a master's student, I make sure to take time every day to wake up at a reasonable time, go for a run, meet with my friends, and go to bed at 1 a.m. And again, especially since everything's virtual, this is even more important, because you want to make sure that you're not just sitting in the same room constantly, that you're interacting with different people, that you're still trying to experience some of the world from a safe and responsible manner. But yeah, taking care of yourself, especially in tech, is extremely, extremely critical. And I cannot emphasize it enough how important it is to make sure that you're physically, emotionally, and mentally safe and secure. And then being a good ally. So again, I am a white woman. I don't identify as a person of color, but I do my best, or I at least am trying to do my best to make sure that I'm uplifting other underrepresented minorities in my community, just because I have a certain amount of privilege, especially by being someone who is a public figure, who is pretty vocal about diversity in STEM. And by taking those moments in your everyday life to advocate for someone, to call out unconscious bias, to petition for something to change in our systemically racist society. These are little actions that you can do every day to make sure that not only you're saying that you care about these other people, but that you're actually doing something about it. And for some people, it might be hard to donate to certain causes or to volunteer, right? But making sure to take a couple minutes every day to maybe read an educational article, or listen to a podcast, or sign a petition. These are small actions you can do to make sure that you're bettering the world, not only for yourself, but also for others. If this is something that people are interested in, which hopefully they are, I subscribe to this newsletter called One Anti-Racist Action a Day. This is specifically for anti-racist resources. And I find it very helpful, because it gives me this bite-sized chunk of a thing to do, in order to make sure that I'm acting as good of an ally as I can be, along with juggling my responsibilities as a student, as a daughter, as a worker, and everything like that. But making sure to be a good ally, especially if you are from more of a majority identity, is really important. So then you can create more of a diverse and inclusive environment for yourself and the people around you. So, and with that concludes my official presentation. Thank you all so much for listening to me speak about the importance of having a diverse workplace and having a diverse tech industry, and my journey as a woman in STEM. Hopefully this gave you some insight into what it's like to be a woman in STEM, and maybe some of the historical context for why it is important to diversify the tech industry. Feel free to connect with me on any of my socials. As Katie mentioned, I go by Coder Caitlin on a lot of them, so I'm pretty easy to find. But I'm more than happy to take any questions now if people have them. Otherwise, you can find me on Discord, since I'm also a hacker for this hackathon. But yes, thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin, for your great talk. I definitely found it really helpful. I learned a lot. I did not know that a bug came from because Grace Hopper found a bug. And also I was really shocked to see the percentage of women go down throughout the years. So I'm going to